Town and country are very closely linked in Italy, the produce of the country providing the wealth of the town. We're now driving northwards out of the city of Rome, and very soon we'll be in the rich, fertile countryside of southern Etruria. Italy, under Augustus, was particularly prosperous and successful, both in political and in an economic sense. And in this program, we shall try to see why. It's a story that has its roots in the events of the previous few centuries during the birth and growth of the Roman Republic. Roads, as everyone knows, serves to link town and country. They get the produce into the town. And of course, as everyone also knows, all roads go to Rome. But here in Italy, they also served another function, that of enabling unification to take place, whether one's talking about 19th century unification or the unification that took place in Italy in Roman times. Here, we're on the Via Flaminia, and if we can get across it safely, what do we find? Well, we're standing on the precursor of this, the present-day Flaminia, on, in fact, its Roman predecessor. And here we see the stones which provide its surface, made of a hard basalt called selce, quarried locally, and as you can see, incredibly durable. Now, this surface is more than 2,000 years old. We know, in fact, its exact date, 27 BC, because this is when Augustus had the Via Flaminia completely repaired over its 209 miles of length, going off to Rimini in northeast Italy. He did this certainly to help the unification of the country, and as we look at it, we see a road which I suspect goes back even before that. We believe that it was first laid out by the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius in 220 BC, and probably there's an Etruscan road again beneath that. So, roads here serve not just an important aspect from the angle of communication, they have a political function as well, and Augustus above all realized that. As Rome began her conquest of Italy, and that's a process which began as long ago as, 500 years before Augustus, she found that various parts of the peninsula were quite urbanized. One thinks, for example, of the south of Italy, which had been colonized long before by the Greeks who had planted so many cities that it was known as Greater Greece. Or one thinks of where we are now, that's to say in Etruria, where the Etruscans had a great many small city-states. And in fact, here we are in Orbetello, in a small Etruscan town. Now, what was the Roman treatment of these towns? Well, of course, it varied. Some it tried to prop up, some they bypassed when they put in the new roads, and others they razed to the ground, building new towns in their place. And here, at Orbetello, looking across the great lagoon of Orbetello, we see one of the early Roman new towns. Cosa. We are here 85 miles northwest of Rome, standing on a high rocky knoll overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. And it was here, at Cosa, that in the year 273 BC, that a party of colonists was sent out by the Roman Senate from the city of Rome. Altogether, how many there were of them, we're not sure, but it's probably a settlement of some 2,500 families, let's say at a guess, some 9,000 people, and they were coming into this area as people who were very much entering into frontier country. It had been conquered only, 7 years before. It was an area, on the whole, insecure, and they were there partly for solid strategic reasons. But we come to Cosa for rather different reasons. Firstly, because it's been very well studied through excavation by the American school at Rome, and secondly, and perhaps equally important, because it is a site where we can see the processes of experimentation in the creation of colonies actually going on. Our colonists here found themselves in difficult, even dangerous territory, and thus their first essential action was to protect themselves, to secure their position. And so, as we can see here behind me, they built themselves a massive solid wall, made in a style familiar to them from their Latin cities around Rome, so-called polygonal masonry, and this massive, secure wall extends for no less than nearly 1 mile around their town. Despite the difficult, awkward terrain which characterizes this hilltop at Cosa, the surveyors nevertheless decided to lay out the town in long rectangular blocks. What's more, they decided to create properly paved streets using the hard local limestone that we see in this area. Indeed, the streets saw so much use that the carts and vehicles eventually carved deep ruts in it, like this example that we have here. Then, beside the roads, we have, of course, the houses of these early colonists. And some of these are large, elegant examples, and let's, in fact, take a look at this one here. This is very clearly a splendid house owned by one of the most patrician, well-to-do members of the community at Cosa, with a series of rooms round a central court. This court is really designed for 2 reasons. First of all, it lets in light to illuminate these rooms, and secondly, it's designed to be a device for collecting rainwater, which accumulates in this impluvium here, and then is subsequently stored in that cistern that we see nearby. Then around, we have these really rather elegant Hampton reception rooms. Rooms which on their floors have fine pavements which to some extent anticipate the great mosaics of the imperial age. And then on the walls, and we can see some fine examples here, we have rather elegantly done wall plaster, sometimes with painted decoration too. And in a house such as this, we find many remains of containers, known as amphorae, which were used for the carrying and storage of wine and oil, a major reason for Cosa's prosperity. The word colony comes from the Latin verb colere, which means to cultivate. So where then did the cultivators of the countryside around Cosa bring and sell their produce? Well, the answer is here. And here we are in the forum of Cosa, a long rectangular court surrounded on at least 2 sides by shops, and within one corner what appears to be a fish market. But administration and justice was also sorted out here as well. And then here, in this open circular space surrounded by these seats, we have the comitium, that's to say an open assembly point where people could discuss matters of importance. And then behind me here, we have the basilica, a large multi-purpose hall, but that's where the justice was sorted out. And this combination of basilica and forum was a model which was to be adopted in almost every Roman town of importance in the Western Empire. This beautiful spot was the arx, or capital of the town. That's to say, the religious focus. Over there we have a small temple dedicated to a Latin goddess, but more importantly, here behind me we have the major temple of the town. That is to say, a building divided at the back into 3 rooms, one here, a central one, and one over on that side. And then in front, a great facade, decorated in the Etruscan manner with terracottas. This temple, harking back to Rome, was dedicated to 3 Roman deities, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and this was a conscious link between the colony and her mother city. However, the very eminent position of the town underlines another important function of it, that here we have a natural refuge. And this, I think, explains why down here behind me we have a great deep cistern, a water storage system, something which is a very common feature on this waterless hilltop, so that a supply is there in case of necessity. However, it's looking down from this eminence over the surrounding countryside that underlines Cosa's prosperity, this immensely rich, fertile farmland. Moreover, we can also see the port, the point from which the produce could be shipped down to Rome, to other parts of Italy, and indeed even abroad. And of course this underlines a crucial feature of the ancient world, that at that time sea transport or water transport was much easier, convenient and cheaper than land transport. And there across the lagoon is Orbetello, an Etruscan stronghold, and thus always a threat to the security of the colonists of Cosa. Nevertheless, despite that threat, the territory was extensively farmed. Banks, as we can see here, marked by a scarp and bushes, divided up the land on the principle known as centuriation. It worked out as one small holding per colonial family. Before long, however, some families began to expand at the expense of their neighbours, building on their plots the celebrated Roman villas. There are three finely preserved Republican examples near to Cosa. These Republican villas emphasize the close relationship that grew up between town and country. Indeed, some display their wealth in the form of revetment walls, which imitate, by use of miniature towers, the form of the facade of a Roman town wall. The extravagance of the period was in fact so great that these three neighbouring villas felt the need to adopt more or less identical architectural expressions of their affluence. Here we've moved out into the territory of the colony of Cosa, a territory of some 200 square miles, to the site of one of these immensely rich and ostentatious late Republican villas that are found within the area. Excavations currently being carried out by an Italian and English team have shown that it was probably built in the late 1st century BC. And despite the fact that what we see here is essentially ostentatious architecture, it nevertheless was a working farm. It's surrounded by this very rich farmland supporting good cereals, wine and olive production, and the excavator, Professor Andrea Carandini, has estimated that something like a surplus of 100,000 litres a year of wine was produced on this estate. So we've seen how the working side of the farm is of fundamental importance in these great late Republican villas, an importance which really is underlined by the buildings that the excavators have found. For example, barns, a complex that they believe are pigsties, and, most important of all, the remains of wine presses and oil presses. This, as it were, epitomizes the reasons for the prosperity and wealth of the Augustan age. Here, however, we've moved up one level across a great ornamental garden, and we're beside a terrace wall which marks the limit between the garden and the Villa Urbana, the place where the master lived. Who then was this master? Well, unfortunately, we can still only guess, but there are some hints from the stamped amphora handles at Cosa. There they mentioned the family, the great senatorial family, the Sestii, and stamped handles of the Sestii have been found at this site too. We can't more than conjecture that it's the same link, but it's a pretty good guess at this moment. So we move first into this cryptoporticus at the back of the ornamental garden. That's to say, a great covered walkway, a marvellous example of Roman architecture of its time using concrete, faced in one or two places with wall plaster, which would of course have been handsomely decorated. Then through a ramp up onto a level above us, which is where the main residence would have been. A handsome residence with a loggia on two sides, giving marvellous views over the countryside, with a great peristyle, a colonnaded court, reception rooms beautifully decorated with painted wall plaster, and then behind that an atrium resembling the atrium that we saw earlier at Cosa. This then is a handsome residence where The villa urbana is twinned with the working side of the farm, a model which was adopted in buildings of this sort of status and class all over Augustan Italy. Now, the wealth produced by the villas and towns of Republican and Augustan Italy went, in terms of traded objects, far beyond the confines of Italy itself. And we can see this by a visit to any great museum, such as the British Museum. Take, for example, this magnificent decorated silver cup with its vine leaves, with its bunches of olives, with its grapes, all succulent and rich and symbolizing that prosperity brought about by the villa and by the countryside. In fact, it's one of a set of silver Augustan cups that comes from Hockwold in eastern England. And it was perhaps a gift to a native prince, because at that time Britain lay beyond direct Roman control. Now, of course, much of the trade must have been in perishable materials. One thinks of textiles or wooden objects, but most particularly of wine and oil. Wine and oil were both shipped in these distinctive containers, amphorae, whose form and type gives us a clue to where they were made and what sort of material they had inside them. And along with lamps, of which we have a lovely example here with a figure on one side, and then on the other we have a name. This is the name of the firm that produced it, and along with amphorae, these firms often stamped their wares, enabling us to reconstruct the pattern of trade. But perhaps the most distinctive tableware object of this period is this high red gloss pottery that we call Aretine ware, because much is made at Arezzo in northeastern Etruria. Sometimes the ware is plain, other times it's decorated with figures which were produced in a mould, like this one here with these lovely dancing ladies, and it's a ware which gets more or less everywhere, certainly in Britain, even as far afield as southern India. Republican and Augustan Italy, therefore, produced and exported its produce very extensively. But it was not an industrial country as we would understand the term. Most firms were pretty small, rarely employing more than, say, a dozen slaves. And the trade, too, was small scale. Most of the markets would have been the local market in the local town. And it's the growth of these towns that is one of the distinctive and characteristic features of late Republican and Augustan Italy. Italy, too, has 28 colonies founded by my authority, which were densely populated in my lifetime. Those are the words of Augustus himself, taken from the Res Gestae, and here, a few miles to the north of Rome, at Lucas Feroniae, we're in one of those Augustan colonies. So, who were these colonies founded for? Well, again, he's very helpful. A little earlier in the Res Gestae, he says this: I settled rather more than 300,000 of these, and he's talking about soldiers, in colonies, all sent them back to their hometowns after their period of service. To all of these I assigned lands or gave money as rewards for their military service. In other words, here Augustus is looking after his veterans. He's settling them down so they won't be a problem. He's creating the beginnings of a professional army. Now, where were these colonies? Well, one here, but most in the north of Italy. One thinks of sites like Aosta, founded in 25 BC, and in its layout very much like a military camp. And two, one thinks of others in that region. But here at Lucas Feroniae, near to Rome, we have not a colony of veterans, but for ordinary resettled people. And it's a fascinating site in that excavations over the last 20 years have disclosed a great deal about the layout of this sort of town, and many of its features hark back to what we've seen at Cosa. One important difference we see behind us here, where we have a massive temple at the end of the forum. And this temple, appropriately enough, is of course dedicated to Augustus himself. There was another older temple too. It lies over on that side of the forum, built a couple of hundred years earlier and dedicated to the goddess Feroniae, hence the name Lucas Feroniae. That's on one side. And then, whilst we know little about that part of the forum, down here we have a magnificent array of shops and bars, the sort of place that you could stop and take a glass of wine with your friends. And then perhaps one might want to go down to the end of the forum where we find a suite of baths, another public place, another public complex. So here in this town at Lucas Feroniae, we can see something of the layout of an Augustan town, a plan which now, in many features, has become standardized not just through Italy, but elsewhere too. One immediately striking feature about the topography of Lucas Feroniae is the flatness of the ground, with, beyond, the Tiber Valley and the Sabine Hills. It is, I think, a marvellous illustration of the peace and security that Augustus brought to Italy. Well, we've seen how important Roman roads are, and here we are, right beside Italy's main trunk road, the Autostrada del Sole. But we're also in the outskirts of the town of Lucas Feroniae, at one of the big suburban villas, one of the villas of the masters. And here we can see its layout with the atrium, the residence area, beyond that a garden. Then the working part of the estate, and then a great peristyle surrounded by small rooms that some people think may have been to house slaves. Now, slaves were one of the great problems of Republican and early imperial Italy. The wars of conquest brought in a lot of people. Slaves were cheap, and wealth came from the wars of conquest. And the problem was that as the rich enlarged their estates using slaves, so did the freemen, poor freemen, become dispossessed. They were away fighting in the wars. And this ultimately was to lead to turmoil and conflict, the sort of problem that Augustus had to try and cope with. And here we are in the residential part of the villa, in the great court lined by a peristyle. Most of this section of the villa was laid out by a family who appeared to have acquired the estate in the 1st century AD. This sumptuously decorated room is the Lorarium, or the shrine of the villa, and it's this room which gives us the name of the owners, the rich owners of this building. They're a family called the Volusii. But it's more than that, I think. It's also a symbol of the power and affluence and wealth of these very rich late Republican and early imperial families. A wealth that they felt a need to display in a very ostentatious way, and a wealth which was to bring conflict in a social sense, in a political sense, and quite often in a military sense as well. These were the sort of problems that Augustus had to face and cope with, and he did so in several ways. Firstly, by settling his retired soldiers, his veterans, in the new towns, in the colonies, in Italy and elsewhere. Secondly, by reducing or even destroying the power of the late Republican families and by elevating new ones, like, for example, the Volusii here. But above all, and this I think is the thing which is important, by creating the conditions for peace so that Italy, with an emperor for the first time and with peaceful conditions, could look forward to a prosperous future.